Thank you for joining us this evening for what promises to be a fascinating and thrilling program. I'm Kiersten Neumann, ISAC curator and curator of the current special exhibit, Megiddo, A City Unearthed, A Past Imagined, with which tonight's program is presented in conjunction. Over the course of this evening, we will explore the complexity and sensational power of media through two divergent yet related avenues. First, the historical headlines and publicity surrounding ISAC's early 20th century Megiddo expedition. And second, the media and reporters connected with two of Chicago's most notorious figures, Johann Hoch and H.H. Holmes. To guide us through the latter, I'm excited to welcome to ISAC Chicago-based author, historian, and tour guide Adam Selzer. Adam is the author of over 20 books, most famously H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil in 2016, it was published, and Graceland Cemetery, which was published in 2022. And most recently, Chicago's Serial Husband, The Marriages and Murders of Johan Hawk. He hosts the popular Mysterious Chicago tours, both live and virtually, as well as a new podcast about Hawk and research called Tomb Snoopers. Before I pass things over to Adam, however, I want to set the stage with an introductory look at some of the historical headlines of the Megiddo expedition, a theme that stands at the core of the current special exhibition. I also invite you to view the exhibit to explore more of these fascinating and strategic stories after the lecture, when the special exhibit gallery will be open alongside a wine reception held in the Mesopotamian Gallery. I'm also excited to say that Adam has brought copies of his new book, and he will have them for sale as well. In 1925, the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, then named the Oriental Institute, launched its first large-scale field project at the site of Megiddo, located in what was then British Mandate Palestine and is today the State of Israel, initiating archaeological excavations that revealed a site of extraordinary depth and complexity, capturing scholarly interest and public imagination alike. Situated at the crossroads linking Egypt and the Mediterranean world with West Asia, Megiddo was shaped by imperial powers, elite wealth, cultural exchange, exquisite craftsmanship, monumental spaces, cycles of diplomacy, and waves of war and conflict. The site's 20 successive cities, spanning from the Neolithic through the Persian period, were revealed to the Megiddo expedition over 14 seasons of excavation, concluding in 1939. This archaeological sequence yielded spectacular discoveries, objects whose later journeys would prove as layered and compelling as Megiddo itself. The system of partage, or we also call this the division of finds, through which artifacts were split between the British Mandate Palestine Department of Antiquities in Jerusalem and ISAC in Chicago, shaped what was collected, exhibited, and valued. As objects were uncovered, studied, and photographed, they also entered a parallel world of media and spectacle. Sifting through the archival records preserved here at ISAC reveals correspondence between the expedition's field directors at Megiddo and ISAC leadership back here in Chicago that frequently highlighted remarkable discoveries being made by the team and how to strategically circulate such news to media outlets. The teams timed sensational headlines, crafted evocative language, and staged artifacts for dramatic photography. The result was a carefully orchestrated media campaign synchronized across global outlets, each proclaiming the significance of the finds for understanding early civilizations and the broader human story. And these were goals that stood at the core of the Institute's founding just a few years prior in 1919. Central to these media features were embellished biographies of the artifacts themselves, often linking them to famed kings, wealthy princes, and biblical figures, with connections drawn to well-known dynasties as well as religious narratives. This spread from a 1937 issue of the beloved Life magazine, featured in the introductory section of the exhibition, includes photograph types common to such media features. Aerial shots of the mound that reveal its scale and layers of deep history, images of archaeological context after excavation, such as buildings and tombs, and close-ups of luxurious artifacts that speak to Megiddo's wealth and role in cultural exchange. One striking case study of how such discoveries entered both scholarly and popular imagination is the so-called gold hoard. Archival correspondence, cables, and media features trace the story of its remarkable discovery, its division, exhibition, and replication. It was excavated in 1937 from the late Bronze Age phase of Megiddo's North Palace, and the hoard became a centerpiece of both archaeological reporting as well as media spectacle. Field director Gordon Loud first shared news of this discovery with ISAC director John A. Wilson in a coded cable. Remarkably, words such as palace, hoard, jewelry, and kingdom appeared in plain English. In a follow-up letter, he confessed that the find had the team more or less stumped, calling it a magnificent collection, absolutely unique in Palestine. He also hoped to acquire several pieces either permanently through partage or on loan. In his reply, Wilson echoed the excitement and noted that, while they preferred to delay public announcement until such objects were held in hand in Chicago, the word gold was, he wrote, too valuable to drop out for publicity purposes. A press release had already gone out and was picked up by newspapers across the country, though without photographs, as the publicity department here at ISAC preferred to use images of objects taken after cleaning, rather than photographs taken in the field. Both men were confident that at least a loan would be possible, and, to quote Loud, "We shall indeed be able to put on a good show, which will, with proper publicity, may swing some cash our way." In his reply, Wilson again stressed the power of the word gold in relation to the hoard and publicity, writing, "Newspapers are waiting with tongues hanging out for feature pictures of the gold objects and an imaginative story to go with this." Ultimately, most objects from the hoard were allotted to ISAC, with an additional 3 objects loaned for a year, making exhibitions in Chicago and New York in 1937 and 1938 possible. The team had already taken a series of photographs on site after cleaning the objects, which they quickly distributed to outlets to generate publicity in advance of the exhibitions. Several of these photographs were included in a St. Louis Post-Dispatch feature, while an Illustrated London Times feature even presented stunning color prints of 2 of the objects. This tale of the gold hoard is told in one section of the exhibition, which includes original media, archival documents, and the artifacts of the gold hoard itself. The fluted bowl, however, is a replica, and this was crafted in Chicago when the original was on loan in 1937. This is but one of the many stories conveyed through archival records and media coverage from the expedition. In this case, a prince from Megiddo was promoted as the figure associated with these objects. Other storied figures drawn into such features and highlighted in the current exhibit included an elite adult woman richly adorned in burial with a suite of gold jewelry and accompanied by fine ceramic vessels and a bone inlaid box. Biblical figures were also a crowd pleaser, with the most notable, though erroneous, connection made between an excavated building resembling stables and the legendary King Solomon. The greatest media hook in this global storytelling, however, was not an individual figure, but something larger and more abstract, Armageddon, the site of the prophesied battle between good and evil. Headlines such as "Spoils of the Spade at Armageddon" turned archaeological discoveries into prophecy-tinged spectacle, while excavations of Megiddo's many levels continued to uncover fortifications, weapons, and destruction layers that testified to real conflicts peppered across the ages. Yet over time, the historical and imagined have drifted apart. Today, Armageddon conjures for many not a place, but an idea. A final reckoning, vividly reimagined in books, films, and pop culture. The exhibition's final section invites visitors to reflect on this transformation through Song for Armageddon, filmed at Megiddo by artists Nick Crow and Ian Rawlinson, with a score by Ofer Itzetsky. The film reflects on the site's layered identity as both archaeological landmark and imagined stage for apocalypse. Blurring history and prophecy. Over the course of one night, workers methodically set up thousands of chairs, preparing an auditorium for an unknown audience. a haunting meditation on our shared anxieties in an age marked by wars, displacement, climate crisis, and collective uncertainty. As Nick and Ian note, the fear that everything might end, it's like the sublime. It's too big a thing. What we see in the Megiddo story is how spectacle and narrative could transform archaeology into global news. That same machinery of sensational headlines and embellished stories was also at work much closer to home in Chicago, where it amplified, muddled, and preserved the legacies of infamous figures such as Johan Hawk. To explore this intersection of crime and media, and how coverage both obscured and revealed the truth, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Adam Selzer.
All right, this feels kind of fortunate. There was actually, the first slide in here was incorrect. It was from when I was speaking the other day. The other day at the Mystericon, we ended up by a unfortunate accident in the Florentine ballroom of the Congress Hotel. One of the slides before had the quote, we stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord. That was something Teddy Roosevelt used to say all the time during his 1912 campaign. He actually held rallies in this room. This is a picture from, I think, 2008. And in the background, we call this a ghost picture because nobody can seem to figure out what that's a shadow of along the back wall. So I always like to imagine that's a picture of me and the ghost of Teddy Roosevelt. But the word imagine is holding a lot of weight here. But I'm Adam Selzer. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for over 20 years now. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out now. I get to be on the History Channel and the Travel Channel all the time. Sometimes on the History Channel, I'm just trying to stop them from going down very strange avenues and conspiracy theories and trying to keep the aliens out of this. I've got a new podcast that I'd be remiss if I didn't plug called Tomb Snoopers, in which Patty Vasquez and I, a radio host, talk about old-time history things and stuff that I've researched, including tonight's topic, Johan Hawk, which is the subject of the whole first season. Not just like talking about the story and separating fact from fiction on Hawk, but going into the details of how we do this, how I analyze these things, how I find these bits of data, and it really gives me a chance to expand on what I was able to fit into the tight word count limit of my new book, which is Chicago's Serial Husband, The Marriages and Murders of Johan Hawk, which came out 1 week ago. Now, Hawk is not particularly famous today. He wasn't famous enough that I could do a really big book on him like I did with H.H. Holmes, The Devil in the White City guy, but he's frankly more interesting to me than H.H. Holmes was, and it was a really fun puzzle to put together trying to figure out what the story was. In 1905, he was the story of the year. So this is a picture from shortly after he was captured in New York as he was being taken back to Chicago on the train, drawing from a couple of days before when he was being interviewed by Evelyn Campbell, who was a Chicago newspaper reporter, with a big headline up there, Johan Hawk's wives now number 40. Now, eventually, they would get to 45 in the headlines. Of those, I can confirm about 20. A lot of them were probably people who were swindled by somebody else and initially told their local paper, oh, that's the man who married me and ran off with all of my money. Then when they finally saw a picture of Hawk, they said, oh, it looks nothing like him. But the story that he had swindled this other person would be in all of the papers. The story that it wasn't really him would just be in the local one. Sometimes these things just simply didn't spread quite right. But Hawk was a Bluebeard first and foremost. He would marry women, take their money, and run all in the space of about a week after meeting them. Sometimes it would take a little bit longer than that, sometimes not even that long, and on at least 5 occasions these wives died under mysterious circumstances within a year of having married him. But we'll get back to him in a second. We'll have to go back a little further in history to H.H. Holmes, the Devil in the White City guy. Now Holmes, at least according to legend, about 6 blocks south of here, had a building that we call the Murder Castle today. It was said to be a hotel during the World's Fair of 1893 that was rigged up with everything you could possibly need to kill a person. This was the Chicago Tribune's first article about it from March of 1893, hid in secret rooms where dealers discover their missing furniture. Now, this was initially a 2-story building with retail on the first floor and apartments on the second. Calling it a castle was kind of like calling a giant dog tiny. It was kind of an ironic title. The place was built horribly cheaply and falling apart. In 1892, with the World's Fair coming, he announced that he was going to add a third floor to serve as a hotel space during the fair. But what he added, the third floor that he added was not a whole lot better than a papier-mâché facade. It was really just a vehicle for swindling investors and suppliers and crockery companies and flooring companies and mattress companies and furniture companies. He would go to all of these places that might supply a new hotel, get all of the stuff that he could, and then not pay for it. He would just take the stuff and sell it for cash. That third floor was rigged up with rooms where the door was wallpapered over so he could hide all of these things until he could sell them. But later on, after he was arrested for faking his best friend's death about a year later, people remembered, hey, didn't this guy have a building back in Chicago that was full of hidden rooms and secret passages? Think we ought to investigate that? And then they decided, nah. And just kind of forgot about it for 6 months until they started finding dead bodies of children that this guy had been traveling with. At that point, they busted into the place, and it was headline news in July of 1895 for 2 or 3 weeks as the police dug through the place saying, hey, we found a rope. Maybe he was hanging people. Or we found a bench. Maybe this could have been a dissection table. And the newspapers reported all of this, and we look back at it now as the press exaggerating things. Really, they were just repeating what the police told them at the time. But of course, newspapers in the day were really just a collection of the gossip of the day. But this is what the headlines looked like as of 1895 when Holmes was in the news. This is pretty typical of an 1895 newspaper, the Tribune in this case. You've got 7 columns, no headline going over more than 1 column. The last edition is all saying that the story of this guy who said he was buying bodies from Holmes to turn into skeletons to sell to medical schools is turning out to go nowhere. The guy's just somebody that the police found who will say whatever the police want him to if they pour enough whiskey down his throat. But that was a very big headline. It's something we still talk about today, but it just gets 1/7 of a column on the first page with some rather pedestrian drawings down below. This is another one from about the same time, closed in on Holmes. Once again, you've got 7 columns going across and no headline taking up more than 1 of them. Now, there were some tabloid-style papers in Chicago at the time. There was one called the Chicago Mail that had at least larger fonts on these single-column headlines about Holmes. See, fiendish, dastard. Quinlan H.H. Holmes is one sure. He murdered Minnie Williams and her sister Minnie too. And these headlines and subheads would go all the way about halfway down. There was one of them where they pretty much debunked their own story within the subhead. Like, red stains on a rope, proof that Holmes was hanging people, might just be red dye. But what really ended up being worked into the story eventually is around the time that the Chicago police were kind of getting laughed at for having said all of these things about the building and then not finding anything, the New York World in Chicago, Old Man Pulitzer's paper, published this article, The Castle of a Modern Bluebeard, on page 23 of their Sunday Pullout magazine. Now, this is something I should point out, is the late 19th and early 20th century, pull-out magazines and Sunday papers were pretty new, and even in the most stuffy and most reliable Just the Facts newspaper, the Sunday pull-out magazines were not unlike the Weekly World News. An article about Bat Boy or Bigfoot would not have been out of place. I found one of them about, like, the mystery of a phosphorescent moose in Canada, or some kind of phantom ghost moose. But this had this lurid diagram with things like the room of the 3 corpses, the black closet, the asphyxiation chamber, the hanging secret chamber, the death shaft, the maze, and speculated, could Holmes have been using this building as a hotel during the World's Fair? The number of people who never returned from Chicago was a long one, and the greater number of foul play was suspected. This very paragraph ends up getting repeated in pretty much everything written about Holmes over the next 120 years. It was really just a New York paper that was just kind of spitballing and speculating, but it became really the foundation of the Holmes legend. And that's not really a function of the press, it's just a matter of that's what held on with people's imagination. That's what people remembered, and when the story got repeated, this is the article that everybody seemed to cite. But right around the same time, well, this is the lurid one, but kind of buried in the middle of the Sunday Pullout magazine. We're going to move ahead 3 years later. 1898, building up to the Spanish-American War, the San Francisco Examiner Now, at the time, William Randolph Hearst only had 2 newspapers. Now, there's been a story that caught on very quickly after the war that Hearst exaggerated all these stories about what was going on in Cuba to try to push the United States into war to sell more papers. That's a narrative that caught on very, very quickly after the war. And I don't doubt that Hearst knew that this was all going to be good for sales, but he only had 2 papers at the time, just one in New York and one in San Francisco. The idea that he could have really pushed us into war with just those 2 papers is really kind of pushing things. But what he was doing was experimenting with much more dramatic artwork that was going right on the front page of papers. In a day when people were selling papers primarily on visual appeal, newsies on the corner waving them around, it's remarkable that it took newspapers so long to figure out that visual appeal would help sell papers. Like usually you were just seeing those ones with 7 columns all in a row. A lot of papers still had the front page just covered in classified ads at the time. Well, the real difference with Hearst was not so much in terms of substance, it was really just in style. But he was also using very lurid drawings. Here's one of Spaniards strip searching a woman. On the right, this very large drawing that covers up almost the entire front page. It's practically art. Keep pushing the wrong buttons here. And then as we go into war later on, you can see these very dramatic uses of very large headlines that go clear across the page using much larger fonts, or this very dramatic version of a ship going through the waves. These kind of things you never saw in papers just a few years before. But this brings us to Chicago, 1900. Now, Hearst at this point had a paper in New York and a paper in California and decided he needed one in the middle, primarily because he wanted to help promote William Jennings Bryan's run for presidency that year. So he went to one of his editors and said, it would be nice if we had a paper launched in Chicago by the 4th of July. It's only 6 weeks away, but we can do that, right? Now, getting a whole paper up and running and on the ground in 6 weeks was almost absurd, but Hearst tended to work well when the situation was absurd. So the editor told him, Chicago's a tough town, you're going to have to shoot your way in. And Hearst said, take all the ammunition that you need, which was not metaphorical. In those days, newspapers were very, very competitive and would hire newsboys not just to sell papers, but also to make sure that their paper had newsies on the best corners, that their papers had the best placement in newsstands, and this was known to get violent, sometimes extremely violent. It's hard to get good data about it because most of the newspapers wouldn't talk about it. Most of what we do know comes from the papers that couldn't afford these kids, the newspaper sluggers, they called them. So the Chicago Chronicle, that didn't use them, had this thing, vendettas of the evening press result in bloody warfare by hired bands of thugs. And by all accounts, when the people who were involved in this recounted it later in the 1950s, they would talk about all kinds of violent murders and crimes. The trouble is, I don't think there's a less reliable source in the world than mid-20th century reporter memoirs. If some reporter in the 1950s said, oh, Calvin Coolidge didn't even exist, we just made that guy up, we were tired of talking about anybody else, that wouldn't have been out of place in a 50s newspaper reporter memoir from this era. But others like the Daybook, law grabs another newspaper slugger, Spike O'Donnell held for murder. Now, Spike O'Donnell would go on to be one of the big bootleggers of the 1920s. It is pretty well established that the newspaper sluggers were almost like the minor league team for the Chicago underworld. Dean O'Banion, the head of the North Side Mob, is said to have started out as a newspaper slugger. People like Moss Enright, certainly, Big Tim Murphy. And we go on here, ooh, there's a headline, Dailies hire thugs to beat cripples. That's 2 out-of-date terms in one headline. Examiner, Tribune, and American once employed Moss Enright, Altman, Dutch Gentleman, and other sluggers. That's the Chicago Daily Socialist in 1911. But we tend to talk about these Hearst papers as having sensationalized stories. It wasn't so much that they did any sensationalizing themselves. They certainly did some, but it was more that they latched on to sensational stories. They especially loved anything where there was a hypnosis angle. And they were not alone in this. All the other papers did this too, and it wasn't that they had to make it up. This was what was coming up in the trials. Now, it's very weird to try to read these articles from the early 20th century about hypnosis and try to figure out what they mean when they say hypnosis in those days. Because sometimes they seem like they're talking about a supernatural power. Other times it seems like some sort of scientific thing that's very new and not yet well understood. Very often when people say that someone was hypnotized, it just means that they were kind of coerced into doing something. We would now just call it plain old coercion. But this is just from a couple of months of Chicago Evening American covers. Demands hypnotic test to save bandit from gallows. And that lawyer for rescue who's mentioned there said that no, my client was only coerced by his friends to do this murder. He was hypnotized into doing it. I'd like to hypnotize him in the cell just to prove how easy it is to hypnotize this guy. The jailer turned him down on that one. This guy would go on to be Johan Hawk's lawyer. But they were also starting to use a lot more photographs in the early 20th century. Now, during the H.H. Holmes days, you never saw photographs in newspapers. It would always just be drawings of photographs. By 1904, that was starting to change. This was a case where a man had rented a car at the auditorium garage, then gone out with the driver. In those days, you got a driver along with the automobile. Took him clear out to Lamont, then shot the driver in the head and disappeared. They never figured out what the murder was, but this was generally said to be the first time anybody had ever been murdered in an automobile. And this is just one of their night extras. They always had the Evening American, the paper that Hearst started, would do edition after edition. Sometimes there'd be a dozen editions over the course of a day, each just a little bit different with new information. Now here they've got a picture of probably the actual car and what looks like the body slumped over in it. You have to kind of read between the lines to see that this is a recreation. A lot of people probably saw this and thought that they were seeing an actual picture of the crime scene. But this brings us to Johan Hawk. At the time that this whole story was going on, Johan Hawk had returned to Chicago. He had lived here off and on for a course of about 10 years at this point. Going back to the beginning of his career, 1895 he came to Chicago and married a woman in Wheeling, West Virginia. There's probably a good wedding photograph of them that was taken, but it just wasn't clear enough for publication in the papers. So one thing they would do a lot is they would just take the heads and paste them onto drawings down below. And everybody would have known this was going on if they looked at it for a second. That newspapers were retouching things for publication was not a secret. You could go to school to learn how to retouch photos for print. The idea that this could influence how the public perceived people later on would be a major topic of discussion a few years later, but it hadn't really occurred to people yet how much influence this could have. But this was a case where Hawk had moved to Wheeling, West Virginia, where he told everybody he had just survived the wreck of the Elba, a ship that had just sunk in the Atlantic. Only about a dozen people survived. Nobody could really look up the list of survivors to see that he wasn't really on the list. At the time, he was operating under the name Jacob Huff, but he married a wealthy widow by the name of Carolyn Hawk. Her previous husband's name had been Johann Adolf Hawk, and just weeks after the wedding, she died of apparent kidney failure. Now, a local Reverend Haas, who had performed the wedding, thought that something was really fishy here. He thought that she had been poisoned. He saw that that this Huff character was going around spending money like a sailor. But as he started investigating him, one day, Huff disappeared. They found his clothing on the banks of the Ohio River, and it was apparently meant to look as though he had taken his clothes off, jumped in the river, and drowned himself. So here's what the headline read the next day. It deceived nobody. The clumsy attempt of Jacob Schmidt, alias Jacob Huff. They had gone through his stuff and saw some evidence that his real name was Jacob Schmidt from Germany. His real name would have been Johann Jakob Schmidt, or in America he would go by John Jacob Schmidt sometime. Only lacks the Jingleheimer. So that was 1895. Right after that, he came to Chicago not only with Carolyn's money, but also with her ex-husband's name. This is a pattern he would use, is that he would continually steal the names of his victims' previous husbands. So when he got to Chicago, he was operating under the name Johan Hawk. Then for a while, he would go back to using his real name in California, and he would bounce back and forth. All of a sudden, in 1904, for, I guess, sentimental reasons, he switched back to Johan Hawk again, and that would be the name that he would use thereafter and would answer to no other. So in 1904, while the Dove automobile murder case was going on, he came back to Chicago and placed a matrimonial ad in the newspapers. That was something people did all the time. He said, I'm a man in my mid-30s looking for a woman to marry. And it was answered by a woman named Marie Walker, who was a divorcee who had been operating a candy store near Lincoln Park. Now, she answered this ad. Hawk came to visit her at the candy store. They spoke for about half an hour. And then he said, I like you, you like me, we can get married then, yeah? I'm trying to do the accent. By all accounts, he talked like a German dialect comedian, so I kind of just tried to do like a German character on The Simpsons. But sometimes they would even transcribe him talking exactly. But they spoke for about half an hour and then decided to get married. They were married a couple of days later. And shortly thereafter, she began to get sick. By some accounts, she had been suffering from kidney disease for a long time. But 5 weeks after the wedding, in January of 1905, she passed away in a little house on 63rd Street that Holmes had rented. Now, while the body was still lying on the bed, Hawk proposed to her sister Emily. And Emily said yes. Now, the day after Marie was buried down at Oakwood Cemetery, he married Emily and Joliet. Then they came back to Chicago to go to her bank, and he said, please draw out all of your money for me. And she did. The next day, he took off for New York. So I'm going to jump ahead. This is a memoir by M.E. Kenigsberg, who was the city editor of the Chicago American at the time. Now, he remembered this well. The way that he told the story was that morning, the day after the Hawk disappeared, he was just going over the marriage permits and burial permits to see if there were any story ideas, saw the name Johan Hawk a couple of times. And he wondered if maybe there was a story there. He said that name suggested no romance, but still he had a hunch. That's the way he remembered it. More likely, he had gotten a tip that something strange was going on. The Chicago American, when they moved into Chicago, they not only bought up the distribution arm of the Chicago Tribune, they also bought up most of the talent and most of the newspaper sluggers. A lot of the best writers in town had moved over to this, and in addition to hiring all the best talent, they also tried to get all the best leads. They had coroner's deputies and police officers and switchboard operators and hotel security clerks, all kind of on retainer. If somebody called the American with a good idea for a story, they could be rewarded with prizes anywhere from going from a box of chocolates all the way up to $2 entire, which was more than the police were paying for leads anyway. They said that the switchboard operators at the Congress Hotel were good for at least a story a week. So, in any case, they got onto the case and found what was going on here, that a man had married his dead wife's sister, then disappeared a day later. There was something strange going on here. So this is how it was covered between the various papers. This is the Chicago Evening Post. Of their 7 columns here, the one number 5 is Death in a Mystery. And this is an evening. This is Hawk had disappeared about 1 day before. So this is the next day later. They've already got it in the evening papers. There's also the Chicago Daily Journal, which is busy with other stories, but there's also buried somewhere onto here, over on the right, wife dead 2 days, man weds sister. Chicago Daily News has it down below. They were an evening paper. This is the sporting extra that came out when the sports scores came in. Down at the bottom, gets bride's cash and goes. But now we're going to take a look at what the Chicago Evening American had that same evening. Dig up bride's 9 days buried body. It wasn't quite 9 days. It hadn't been nearly that many. Was she killed? If so, by whose hand? Now, they have already got pictures of Emily. They've already got a picture of Marie. They had already interviewed a lot of the neighbors. They had interviewed Marie's nurse already. They had talked to all sorts of people and gotten the story pretty well put together. They were still a little bit foggy on some of the details, but those would be cleaned up over the next few editions. But they had much more data than we were seeing in either of the other evening papers at the time. The next morning, it was on the front page of the Chicago Daily Inter-Ocean, bridegroom flees, mystery of wives' deaths unsolved. And by this time, they're starting to put together that there are other wives connected to this, that there are other people that this guy is suspected of marrying and possibly even murdering. By the next afternoon, the Chicago Evening American actually has a picture of Marie's open grave and a better picture of Marie herself. They had already determined that something was fishy in this death and were already doing some digging to try to figure out whether she might have been poisoned. And within it, the very next day, they were already starting to compare it to the H.H. Holmes case. Especially, they had noted that this house where Marie had died on 63rd Street, just below, on Union Avenue, just below 63rd, was a stone's throw away from the old Holmes Castle building. You probably could have stood on the porch and seen that building. It was barely a block away. They were also already publishing things like Marie's death certificate had already been found. Then another picture of her in her one of his other wives in her wedding dress. There's Inspector Shippey down below with a couple other police officers, and you can even see the coffin down below. Very quickly, though, the police were already going around saying, we know that this was a poisoning case, we are going to hang Johan Hawk. So they were kind of freaked out when it said here that Mrs. Hawk was not poisoned. Now, I got to talk a little bit about Inspector Shippey. Just recently, there had been a murder case where Shippey had rented a horse that he believed that the murdered man had rented once before to see if the horse might magically lead him to the body. Shortly thereafter, they found the body. He had the body propped up in a mausoleum sitting on a chair and then led all of the various suspects into that mausoleum to see if they would be scared into confessing. He was probably already suffering from the dementia that would end his career a couple of years later. We're also talking about Coroner Hoffman here, who would be sheriff in the 1920s and so corrupt that he ended up spending time in his own jail. As the coroner, he was known to rule that a man who had molten lead poured all over him at the factory had actually died of tuberculosis. Both of these guys were a mixture of ineptness and corruption that really I think that anybody who was prosecuted by these two probably should have been given a commuted sentence just on general principle. But it wasn't until a few days into this that they were able to get enough into the newspaper archives, enough of their own archives, to realize that they had just talked about this guy 4 or 5 years before. Back in 1898, he had been arrested and held in the Bridewell, the jail for small offenses, under a different name, and actually made national news for the fact that he had apparently married several women in the past year around Chicago, Milwaukee, and New York, and he was even connected to the case in West Virginia where Carolyn Hawk had been apparently killed. Meanwhile, back in West Virginia, they had recently gotten a letter saying, remember that Jacob Huff guy that you thought might have killed his wife? Well, he got hanged in Germany a couple of months ago. He came back there, admitted all these murders, he was hanged, so you don't have to worry about him anymore. Hawk himself probably wrote that letter. When the story about the 1898 guy in Chicago who'd married all these people came out, Reverend Haas was able to write to Chief Calderon with the photograph and saying, hey, is this the guy? And confirmed that it was the same guy. At this point, they did finally exhume the body of Carolyn, but the body was too deteriorated to really tell anything. Plus, the undertaker had used arsenic in the embalming fluid. This made it a perfect crime. Arsenic was usually an embalming fluid back then, so as soon as an undertaker stepped into a room, there wasn't really going to be a conviction. But Hawk hadn't really been following the advances in the embalming arts and sciences. He didn't realize that Marie had been embalmed with a different kind of fluid that contained no arsenic. But it took until the 23rd until they were able to dig up his old mugshot from the Bridewell and publish it in the Chicago Evening American. But we've got this big, big headline, more death. And that's actually not about Hawk. That's actually what was going on in Russia at the time. And it's a weird little parallel that over the course of these couple of weeks that Hawk was so much in the news, you see competing headlines for the number of people Hawk killed as going up, and the number of Jews slaughtered in Russia keeps going up as well. But this is the first real photograph of him that had been published. Back in 1898, they were still just publishing drawings. But this is going back to his first Chicago wife. In 1895, after killing Carolyn Hawk, he had come to Chicago using the name Johan Hawk, married another wealthy widow named Julia Steinbrecher, who died 5 weeks after the wedding. But this is the picture as it was published in the Chicago Evening American, and it's probably the best version there is. This is just as a comparison. This is how it appeared in other papers. Now, the reason it looks so slim in this other one might just be because of how they set the lens when they were printing it. It might have been a little bit elongated, probably not an attempt to deceive anybody. It's probably just how it was set that day. The one on the right is clearly a little bit touched up, and probably, again, just to look clearer for publication. By the time it got to whichever paper this one was in, it might have been a few generations of degradation, so they would have had to clean it up somewhat. But then again, it's only on that one in the middle that we can really see the lettering down at the bottom, so that might be the most complete version. Meanwhile, at the Chicago American, there was a reporter named Evelyn Campbell. Her real name was Nana Springer, and that was not a secret. Sometimes they would credit her under her real name, but she was fairly famous in Chicago at the time. She had been covering every manner of case. She had just done a thing where she slept the night in the YWCA to see if people were getting robbed there, which they were. She had covered all of the major murder trials. She just done a thing about whether toy soldiers turn children into violent maniacs, and whatever she was assigned on a given day. One thing about Hearst is that he was very good about bringing in experts, and he was very good about hiring women to write for him. He believed that women writers brought in women readers, and Evelyn seems to have been doing a lot more of the actual writing of her own, too. As the way the papers tended to work at the time is Hearst believed that some people were good at finding data and some people were good at writing. Most people were not good at both. So you'd have a guy who was the leg man going around like writing things down on his tablet. They would call the data into the rewrite desk. The rewrite would turn it into something, then the rewrite would turn it over to the typesetter, who might change things around a little bit more just for clarity or just to make it fit within the column. And it's important when we go looking through newspapers and looking for how they change from edition to edition to try to think of how this would have been set up. Why are these names different from article to article? Why are some of the bits of data different from article to article? There's probably some things just get lost in the shuffle. But Evelyn Campbell was known to do both. There were times when she was out doing a story and would like ask the telegraph operator if he could write this story in, and he'd say, "Oh, I don't have time for that." And she'd say, "Well, move over, I'll telegraph it in," and would just send her own story in. Now, she had grown up in the Midwest, worked in Wisconsin for a while. She was in her 20s, living in the Brewster Apartments, and got really hooked on the Johan Hawk case. After a couple of days, she was telling her readers, "Please follow along. Day by day, I shall help to unravel this case. Inspector Shippey has made me a special deputy. If you know anything, if you have heard anything about this man or knew anybody who married him, please won't you get in touch with me at the following address." And this kind of drew readers in and made the whole thing part of a play-along game. And within a couple of days, the American had advertisements that said, "Are you following Miss Campbell's Hawk clues? The police are." And this was probably true. She was probably getting a lot better data than the police were. Most of the people connected to Hawk over the years had been women living around Chicago who were probably a lot more comfortable going to her than they were going to Inspector Shippey. Or the Chicago American was also more likely to give them a couple of bucks than Inspector Shippey was. So she ended up getting mixed up with a big part of the story, though, was that a lot of people not only thought that Hawk was similar to H.H. Holmes and lived near H.H. Holmes, but they started believing that he might have been H.H. Holmes' janitor inside of the building. For a couple of weeks, this was the biggest part of the story, that all these people who had lived and worked around the building were coming forward saying, "Yes, I knew that man back then." The difficult thing is that no two of them seem to be describing the same guy. One of them would say, "I knew that man, that was Jake the janitor." Another one would say, "No, that's Jake Hatch. He was the financial agent. He's the one that Holmes said did all the real murders and has been missing all this time." And the weird thing is this allowed them to rehash the entire Holmes story, which by that time was about 10 years in the past. And what's remarkable is how badly they all remembered it. Even people who were involved in it. The story hadn't been retold in that entire 10 years. There hadn't been a book about it that anybody had read. The newspapers had, rehashed it occasionally if somebody connected to the case died. But even people who were involved in it, like E.H. Robinson, who ran the drugstore in the Castle building, said flatly, "That man is not a guy that I ever saw around the castle, and if he had been there, I would have known him." I know that people are saying he's Jake Hatch, the man that Holmes said was the real killer, but I can tell you that's not him. There was never a Jake Hatch in the story. It was Edward Hatch, but nobody had the stuff refreshed for them, so the story just wasn't fresh in people's minds. They hadn't seen a picture of any of these guys in years. But this version of the story is what got his picture published in the New York American and Journal, the Hearst paper out in New York, and this really is why he was captured. Hawk had run away to New York. The police had some leads that he might be in New York. A couple people who'd known him in both cities had written and said, "I know that I saw this guy around New York. He's in the same place he always stays when he's in town." But he had briefly stayed at his usual New York hotel, which was right where the World Trade Center is now, then moved up to a boarding house on 47th Street where he had already proposed to the landlady. Now, the landlady was a woman named Catherine Kumerl. She said to the papers, "I've been married 5 times. I could get another husband if I want, but at the thought of a man making love to me just disgusted me by then." But this guy moved into the boarding house and immediately started peeling potatoes and saying, "See how good I am at peeling potatoes? I'd make a good husband for you, don't you think?" This was exactly the kind of way he worked. He would find women and figure out not only that they needed a husband, but what kind of husband they wanted. One wife described him as a very pious man who was always breaking into psalms. Marie, the last Chicago wife that he murdered, was very skeptical about the church, so he would make anti-church speeches around her. He would find out what they want, be that guy for a month. So while he was here, she started to get suspicious, like, this man sounds like Jack the Ripper. And at one point he said, this man sounds like that awful man in Chicago that's been in the papers. And one day while she was riding the train, she saw somebody reading the paper, and there was this picture, which she recognized as the guy who was in her boarding house. Eventually, the Chicago Journal published this recreation of her, sitting there reading their version of the newspaper, which is kind of a mock-up. But it was absolutely because of this that she went to the police. The police went over to interview this guy, spoke to him for a little bit, and figured out that this was the guy, and finally said, "How are you doing, Mr. Hawk?" And Hawk said, "I'm well, but my name's not Hawk." He tended to slip up on his lies pretty quickly. So here he was captured in New York. They got the mugshot down below with his hat on and everything. And at this point, Evelyn Campbell was still involved in the case. There was an inquest in Chicago where several of the women he had married here in town met face to face. The opening of the quote was as the newspaper transcribed it, was, "Well, I never." Just like I'd hoped. But there was a woman he had married about a year before in Chicago named Anna Hendricks. They were married for about a month, and then he pulled his usual trick of saying, "Well, I keep telling you I wish you didn't have any money so people won't think I'm marrying you for the money. I have to take that back now. I've just found out that my father has died in Germany, and I'm set for a big inheritance, but I need some money to go to Germany. So can we go to your bank and take out all of your money?" He then took out $500 from her account and just disappeared. So Evelyn had interviewed her. You can see her in the back of the drawing here. This is another case where we've got a photograph of Anna and a photograph of Hawk, but they've just pasted the faces onto the body, with Evelyn standing in the background. Now, Evelyn took Anna to New York to go to the police station to identify Hawk in a lineup. And this really made her famous. Over on the left here, there's a headline about a guy, Frank Comerford, who had, a kid in his early 20s who'd been elected to the state house and now was suddenly making speeches about how the state house was fabulously corrupt. And the state house responded by expelling him from the body. But he's going to come up again in the story in a bit. So this became a major story in New York as well. They brought in Frances Mall, their own reporter, who would go on to be one of the most openly lesbian writers of her era. She interviewed Hawk on the train as they hauled everybody back. They also interviewed Reverend Haas. Haas provided a picture of Hawk that had been sent over from Germany a few years before. Still believed that Hawk had been on the shipwreck, the Elbe. But Evelyn ended up interviewing him first in his cell, and as he was walked from the police station over to the police court, and then on the long train ride that went all the way from New York to Chicago, where he was just surrounded by reporters. A lot of the people reprinted these interviews. Only a couple of them actually credited Evelyn Campbell with it, but some of them did. But this is a picture Hawk took after he got to Chicago. He was taken over to the Bush Temple of Music building that is still standing on Chicago Avenue. There was a barber shop there. And once he was all spruced up, he said, "I will consent to have my picture taken for the newspaper, but only if I am surrounded by all these men around the station who look exactly like me. I want people to see how easy it is to mistake me for somebody else." Now, strangely enough, the Chicago Daily News told this story that was why he had consented to be photographed, but at least in the versions that are surviving on microfilm, I don't think they ever ran the photo. It does happen to be in their archive, though, so you can see these guys that he said all looked just like him. Now, that police officer on the right, they really did say resembled him almost exactly. You can't really see it from this picture. But there's also this shot of him with Inspector Shippey, Detective Loftus, and Coroner Hoffman. These guys all look more like him than anybody in that picture. And name this band. So At that point, Hawk was put on trial. The story went underground for a while. The trial was rather uneventful, but he was eventually sentenced to be hanged, sentenced strictly for the murder of Marie. Now, a lot of people thought that he had been railroaded. The amount of arsenic they found in the body and the condition of the stomach indicated that that arsenic must have been put into the stomach after the body had already died. This came up in the trial, but Plotke, the lawyer, just did a terrible job with it. I think there's ample evidence that the police, having already said that they were going to hang this guy, might have been inclined to put some arsenic into the stomach just in case. But he said, so, isn't it true that arsenic is found in cemetery soil? Isn't it true then that that arsenic could have gotten into the stomach through the coffin? Like, well, maybe over the course of several years, but not in 48 hours. Some people believe that Hawk was entitled to a new trial just because Plotke had been such a bad lawyer. But really, the newspapers didn't publish what I found to be the most compelling evidence, which was just how much of the arsenic was found in the rectum. More likely, the arsenic that killed her had not been administered through her food. It had been administered through the enemas that the doctor had prescribed. But the newspapers didn't want to talk about that. They would publish ads for constipation cures all day long, but not the actual talk about enemas was just further than they wanted to go. So a lot of people ended up with the impression that Hawk might have been railroaded, that he might not have killed this person. Nobody actually saw him administering the arsenic or anything. But in July, when he was in the process of trying to get a reprieve, and he was reprieved a couple of times, the Evening American published this huge article, How I Married 50 Wives and What Became of Them, that was supposed to be Hawk's confession. This was in the Sunday Pullout magazine, and probably Hawk had nothing to do with this. They have pictures of the various wives over on the side, but some of the pictures get reused. One picture serves for 2 or 3 of the different wives. The story itself is mostly complete nonsense, and Hawk himself really objected to this. He wrote to the Chicago Journal saying, "This is all the Chicago American's fault. If I am convicted, it is entirely because of the American." It's not like the Journal had portrayed him as innocent this whole time, but they were willing to print this because they never missed a chance to rip on the American. In this case, if the Chicago American would like something really shocking, why not let it print the story of how it gave Evelyn Campbell a pocket full of gold pieces, which she offered me in the Chicago Avenue police station after exhausting other wiles for a confession. But around the same time, there was an article, an interview with him that really was based on a real interview, and that was a reporter named Jean Cowgill. Now, she was writing for the Chicago Chronicle. By this time, she was mostly writing for magazines. In her teenage years, she had gotten married young and joined a theatrical troupe, traveling around. She and her husband would put on a play called Is Marriage a Failure? That was one of the hits of the era. In their case, it was, in fact. They got married by the time of the Hawk case. She was a single mother, and writing a lot of articles that would break into short stories, talking about a mother telling her daughter about the wild world outside and how she herself had experienced the wildness of the world and it had brought her nothing but misery. She had gotten kind of equal parts progressive in some issues and very stuffy in others. She was writing articles like a whole series called The Perils of a Big City. Like this article, Chop Suey Joints, a Menace to Morality. It's not as bad as it sounds. She actually said chop suey is an excellent food that is served at good prices, and she mentions that, yes, sometimes the proprietors marry white women, but she had no problem with that. Her issue was some of the people who might go to these chop suey joints might be sex workers, and unaccompanied women might end up at the same table as them. It was really exactly the same thing she said about ice cream joints around the same time. But when she interviewed Johan Hawk, she became convinced that he was actually innocent. She realized, the police were really just trying to find someone to convict. That was their job, not necessarily to get at the truth of the matter, but to convict somebody. So she also happened to be dating Frank Comerford, the lawyer who had just been expelled from the House of Representatives. And with Plotke making a fool of himself, Plotke was dismissed, and coincidentally, Comerford came to be the new lawyer, the reporter's boyfriend. This is actually an article from a few months before. We've got deadly poison is found, and Comerford's charge may cost him his seat, running right next to each other. So this is just a look at a full day of the Chicago American on the day Hawk was trying to get a reprieve. This was a day when he was about to be hanged. They had brought him to the death cell where prisoners would spend their last night, but it was also known that the reason this was happening is because he couldn't raise $300 to get a review of his case written up to present to the state Supreme Court. And even the jailer, even the prosecuting attorney said this is if he is hanged tomorrow, it will be a black mark on the state of Illinois. A man shouldn't be hanged just because he can't get $300. So this was day after, all day long. We get people starting to pledge Hawk money. Hawk gets an hour more. Hawk reprieve, then finally reprieve right at the end. Frank Comerford was running around the police station like Paul Revere, shouting out the news to everybody. Only one newspaper mentioned that Jean Cowgill was present at the time too, but she was there. But this wasn't enough. The case was reviewed by the Supreme Court. Emily Fisher, the last wife, took back most of her testimony and said the police had put her up to saying they were going to convict her of murder if she didn't, which is possible. But finally the day came that Hawk was hanged in 1906. This is the Evening American's headline. It covers the entire front of the page, the biggest font that they could break out. This is the extra edition that was going to be sent to outlying towns. It was printed up ahead of time. They knew Hawk was being hanged that day, so they had written a story that was kind of a masterpiece of vague writing. They talked about like the sound of the footsteps coming down the hall, how the gallows area itself was drafty, the eerie silence and the dreadful thud of the trap door. They wrote about this as though it had already happened, but really it had not. It was just stuff that no doubt would happen. There was only like one minor detail about the order of the procession, like which priest was present that day, that ended up being wrong. And I imagine that most of the people in the outlying towns knew that this would have been printed hours earlier just to get out where they were in time. But it was very good piece of writing of speculating exactly what was going to happen. But the trouble is, Mr. Kenigsberg, the city editor, would remember this for years. This was a story that would be told in like the Billy Goat Tavern and other places where reporters hung out for years and years, is they knew that this was going to be a big story, so we printed up about 300,000 of these in advance. He was just waiting to get the signal. They had a guy stationed at the window at the jail where the hanging was, who would be waving a handkerchief to give the signal that the execution had started. Then another one, a red one, to show that it had taken place. That would be relayed to somebody at the newspaper office, and as soon as they got that signal, he would give the go-ahead to send all of these out. The white one went. The white handkerchief was raised. The procession had started, so he went ahead and gave the order. Then realized a few minutes later that the red one had never been waved. Comerford and a guy named Edward Maher, who was H.H. Holmes's lawyer for a while, had been going around trying to get another reprieve. They had finally gone to the office of Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who would later be the commissioner of baseball and was known as a real wild card. It's very easy to imagine him saying, yes, I had my doubts about that case. Let me sign this paperwork right now. But he kind of waffled on the whole thing, saying, I know it's very popular to want this guy not to be hanged. I can see that there's a couple of inconsistencies in the case here. Give me a couple of hours and I'll see if I can come up with this paperwork. And they said, well, you've only got half an hour before they're going to hang him. And he said, I said what I said. I'll see you after lunch. So he went off to lunch. They tried to chase him around town, but it was no good. Eventually, he did sign off on the paperwork, but by the time they did, Hawk was hanged. And the newspapers were at least able to breathe a giant sigh of relief and start publishing their other editions over the course of the rest of the day. But going through this now, when you read through articles about Hawk that have come out in the last couple of decades, a lot of them are still telling stories that got debunked at the time. Like one of the bigger ones, for example, is he was accused of having married a woman under the name Count Otto von Kern. Now, this was in a lot of papers that he had married this woman under the name Count Otto von Kern. It was only in the woman's local hometown paper that she gave an interview herself saying, no, that's just my sister talking. I did marry a man who deserted me named Otto von Kern, but he never said he was a count, and he never looked anything like this Johan Hawk guy. But that only made it into one of the papers. Nobody could really keep track of everything that was going on. Nobody could really have the resources to even know that Carolyn Hawk, Carolina Miller, and Carolyn Hoff were all the same woman. Or nearly all of them went by Mary Hawk at one time or another. Trying to sort out who was something that even now that I could get all of these papers at once was very, very difficult to sort out. But now we can finally go back and get all of these things and also go through the marriage records and the paperwork and the legal files and put at least a bit more of the story together. But there was just a video on him that came out on YouTube. It was made entirely by AI. I haven't watched it, but the title and description is about 20 words long and 9 of them are wrong. Most notably, sometime in the 60s, an article came out referring to him as Johann Hawk, probably just confusing the Otto von Kern thing. Almost everything written about him now calls him Johann Hawk. I can't find a single instance of him having actually used that name. So this is a case now where the papers are why he was caught. They published almost all of the relevant data about the man, and also are part of the reason why it became so sensationalized and why it's so hopelessly muddled today. It's sort of the double-edged sword, but really it's the journalism is just what we make of it. All right, I think I can go to questions at this time. Thanks.